Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you joined us today. And we are continuing our path through the Daodejing. And currently we're in chapter 17. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Is everybody seeing that okay?
Yep.
All right. Well, we're going to just kind of jump in here and kind of dissect it along the way. And then we'll have a little bit of kind of a diversion at the end where we're going to look at Zhuangzi, who's another early Taoist writer that has some things to say that are in a similar vein to what we're looking at with this chapter. So this one starts off, and we're using a different translation today. This is from a translator named MacDonald. And so if you're wondering why it doesn't match up with our normal translations, this is the one we're looking at today. It says, the best leaders are those that people hardly know exist. And this is kind of interesting. So one, it reminds us that there's definitely a political angle that's happening with the Daodejing. It's getting into the question about how do we handle governance of people, specifically around the question of, the Warring States period and trying to bring some stability to what's going on. But we're going to see here that we, right off the bat, are having a pretty serious challenge to, in particular, the Confucius idea. So within Confucianism, remember, there's a lot of concern about the proper hierarchy of things and how you show proper honor and respect to the people who are in different positions. So when you think about leaders, especially like the ultimate leaders, like the emperor, let's say, there is this expectation that there's a great deal of honor and respect, and there's somebody who's very visible and very much kind of a figurehead for the whole of the people. And here in the Daodejing, it's saying something completely opposite. The best leaders are the ones that you don't even realize exist. You don't even you don't see them or hear from them. You don't understand maybe what they're even up to, but you maybe have some kind of an idea that they're there. So this is kind of an interesting twist on how this is approached that we'll kind of flesh this out a little bit further as we go. But at this initial phase, we just want to see how there's this contrast between what's normally thought of in terms of great leaders. Even within our own context, we think of people who are great leaders as people that are definitely out front and center, who are leading the charge and are well respected and well known. So this is a little bit different. Then it continues. It says, the next best is a leader who is loved and praised. So here would be something that's more along the lines of what we would see for something like Confucius, right? Where that kind of leader is there, but it's placed kind of second best to what the Taoists are saying would be the ideal. So we have kind of that secondary stage here that's kind of interesting. After we have the discussion about what would be like the Confucius leader, So here we have next best. It's not saying that this is horrible. It's just one that is after the ideal, but then it kind of continues to degrade. Next comes the one who is feared. Now there's another set of thinking that happens within this 100 schools of thought, and one of the other dominant schools is what's often referred to as the legalist. And so here we have the leader that is coming in with the threat of punishment or promise of reward, and so there's this more of this kind of a fear approach, and this is even further down the line, kind of further devolving in terms of leadership, if you will. And then it says the worst one is the leader who is despised. And then it follows with kind of a comment that I think is related to this worst case scenario. If you don't trust the people, they will become untrustworthy. So we definitely have this kind of movement of best, and it kind of steps down and steps down and steps down, where we have the kind of the different ways that things are arranged in terms of how we think about leadership. And definitely we can see with this last part about if you don't trust the people, they will become untrustworthy. There's a lot that kind of gets me thinking about even our current day situation, right? Whether we're talking about business leadership, or we're talking about community leadership, or we're talking about like government leadership, you can see these different kinds of leaders, right? There's not so much the ones that are kind of the Taoist ideal, where they're kind of in the background, but we definitely have ones that are well liked and praised, and we like those kind of leaders because it feels like there's a good connection, they're getting stuff done, we're excited about that. But then there's the ones that come in and maybe they're not the most charismatic, or they don't have people's attention so much, but they try to control things through the rules and regulations and try to make things happen. And we tend to not like them very much, but they somehow have power that we can't get out of. And then, of course, there's the ones that just are like, horrible. And part of where that horribleness comes from is they don't even think that people that they're in charge of can be trusted. And so they deal with them in ways that are maybe less humane. And in that less humane treatment, you end up with people behaving in ways just out of frustration, or out of lack of necessities, or out of just rebellion, that make that seem like they live up to that idea of untrustworthiness. So we had a chat come in. Let me see what's being. Oh, okay. So there's, definitely some interesting ways that they're looking at this idea of leadership and how it kind of devolves. And then it's going to bring it back around to this ideal leadership. And in that ideal leadership, it says, here we go. The best leaders, so getting back to that one at the top of the list, value their words and use them sparingly. So they're careful about what they're saying. They're not just making a lot of promises. They're not just throwing out things to divert. They are being very considered in the words that they're using. And then it finishes by saying, when the master, and this would be in this case like that best leader, has accomplished her task, the people will say, amazing, we did it by ourselves. So I think part of what's happening here when they're thinking about this ultimate kind of leader is it's really the kind of person who's empowering the people to actually do the things themselves. It's essentially creating the conditions whereby amazing things can happen. But the people are the ones that are actually doing it. The ones that they're responsible for are able to take credit for the stuff that they're doing, and they are provided with the things that they need to accomplish the tasks that they need to do. And so this is where you can see kind of that style of leadership is much more in the background, providing, let's say, the context in which things can thrive. And if we're thinking about this larger Taoist perspective that everything is interconnected, then it's really creating a context in which these, and also their concern for the natural phenomenon, how things naturally arise. It's orchestrating a context in which that can thrive, which means there's not a lot of interference that's going on. It's much more about protecting the space for people to be people, and for the work to kind of unfold in the way that it would naturally unfold, and the relationships the way they would naturally unfold. So there's probably a lot of questions about something like that kind of leadership. Like, how would that work? Is it possible for that to work? Is it going to be something where people just live up to these expectations, or is it going to devolve into mayhem and people are just going to kind of do what they want to do? I have some thoughts on this, but I'm curious what you guys think about a type of leadership that's essentially trying to maintain the context where the people can essentially do what they need to do, almost kind of self-directed or non-directed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, it sounds a lot like, all of my LinkedIn in the past few years.
All of what
Like
was that?
LinkedIn,
Oh, what happened on LinkedIn?
like everybody is posting those inspirational posts of, like, good leader is that, and our leaders don't take credit, and they empower their people to be the success stories and such. And second, I totally agree with that. I think that at the end of the day, it's the workers who do the work, and the leadership is enabling them to do the work. So when we accomplish a task, it is um, it is oftentimes because of people doing the work. Now, let's be honest. People couldn't accomplish the work if they were unable, if they were enabled. Sorry, if they were not enabled to do the work. So there's of course credit to be given to the leaders for leading and enabling and creating the environment that allows the people to be successful. But I really like this idea of the leadership being there to enable and lift up the employees and the people I'll say below, I guess, in the structure, to just be successful and not take credit for their success. I think there is a differentiation between success in the space of we accomplished the task and we are the ones who did it, and then there's a separate success in terms of I enabled my team to be successful, which is a different thing to be uh, to be praising, and a different thing to be celebrating.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would just say one of the things that sometimes comes up with more of this Taoist perspective is that there is a concern that without like more of a strong leadership, that people are just going to kind of devolve into who knows what, right? That you need somebody to kind of be guiding them and affecting them, or it's going to be chaos. And of course, this is a lot of the claims that happens from leadership or from different levels of control, is that without us, you would be in trouble, that you need us for, you know, how we structure like the economy, or how we, provide commonality in terms of language, or travel and security, and all the different things that they bring up in terms of the things that are needed by their involvement in how humans interact. And of course, when you see something like, wars breaking out, or in the case for them with the Warring States period, that might be something where it really comes more to fruition, where they're saying, look, the reason we're having all this chaos is that our government structures have broken down, or that the proper relationship between, leaders and followers is not there, and we need to reestablish that. So from a sociological perspective, there's kind of some interesting challenges about how control structures are justified or legitimized based off of this need that without it, humans would basically flounder or be cruel to each other. A lot of the post-apocalyptic type movies that we see when governments fall is, it basically turns into like, either, zombies, or it's going to be something like Mad Max, where it's like everybody for themselves. And it's interesting. I don't know if anybody's come across this book called Tribe. I can't remember if it's called Tribe or Tribes, but he does kind of some surveys of different things about, well, what happens to humans in, situations where there's big disasters. And more often than not, they end up coming together in amazing ways to help each other. And I think that the Taoists would agree that more of the human nature is about this idea of compassion when it's liberated from these other constraints. And especially when we're forced into difficult situations, we're much more concerned about how do we help each other than how do we tear each other down. Of course, there's always exceptions to this, but it does bring up some interesting questions about how do we want to think about structuring, how humans live in community, in society. What does that look like? And their critique would definitely be that a lot of what's happening with something like the Warring States period is that they're trying to force an unnatural constraints or structures on people that require a lot of effort to maintain, and ultimately backfire and erupt into conflict and chaos. So I wanted to kind of share a little bit from Zhuangzi, who's another early Taoist writer. And maybe I'll just kind of stop doing the share here so that we can see the book a little bit better. But here's the book I'll be reading from, Zhuangzi. And this is got some interesting stuff going on here. In chapter 10 is what I'm going to be reading from, just some excerpts. But I'll be curious what you guys think of this. So it starts off by saying, to protect your trunks, your sacks, and your cabinets. So we have to think about, more agrarian style people. They got their trunks, right? To protect your trunks, your sacks, and your cabinets from thieves who would break into them, rifle through them, burst them open, no doubt you will bind them tightly with seals and ropes, secure them firmly with latches and locks. This is what common sense calls wisdom. But when a great thief arrives, he will take away the cabinet on his back, haul off the trunk, shoulder the sack, and make off with it, fearing nothing more than the seals, ropes, and latches and locks are not secure enough. So this thing that you've been calling wisdom, is it anything more than piling up the loot for the really great thieves? So you might be thinking, where is he going with this? He's making a distinction between what we might call petty criminals that might come in and rifle through your stuff and steal things, and something that he's referring to as great thieves. And he goes on to tell the story about this country of Qi that ends up getting essentially kind of taken over by somebody who comes in and just essentially kind of steals the country. And he says, but in the process of doing that, they don't get punished for this great theft. They actually are rewarded with, now they're living in the palace. Now they've got all the adulation. Now they've got all the people respecting them. They've got, he stays on the throne for like 12 generations. So there's kind of like this contrast that's getting made between, every day, let's say kind of somebody breaking in the house to steal something versus, something big like stealing a whole state, and how that doesn't result in the person actually even getting into trouble. He goes on to say, are not all so-called perfect sages really just bodyguards for the great thieves? So when you think about governments and other kinds of political authorities, part of what they have to deal with is, again, this legitimization for why am I here? And a lot of how they do that is through more of a propaganda type of an approach of appealing to either moral questions, we're on the right side of this, or they're appealing to, divine sanctions, like, this is a divine mandate that I have this position, or they're appealing to, some other type of connection where all these things are supposed to be justifying this position of authority, and they're represented by the priests, by the sages, by the ministers that are representing these people in positions of authority. And he's making the statement, aren't they just, in a sense, kind of functioning as bodyguards? We hold them up as examples of morality or of upholding the religion or upholding, the wise sayings, but really that it just ends up being a way of supporting the power structures that are in place. And he kind of asks a question, or brings up this interesting question. So there's kind of a foe throughout Zhuangzi who's called Robber, and I don't know if his name is Ji or Ji, because sometimes it can be pronounced a little bit different, but we'll just say Ji. So Robber Ji. And it says, once Robber Ji's disciple asked him, do robbers also have the Tao? Ji said, where can one go without the Tao? To guess where the treasure is hidden is sagecy, or basically it's a wise action. To be the first to go in is courage. To be the last to leave is responsible conduct. To judge whether a job can succeed or not is wisdom. To distribute the loot equally is human kindness. no one can become a great robber without these 5 virtues. So it's kind of interesting, right? He's thinking it's kind of playing everywhere, but how are they learning these things? How are they getting these like sage advice? Well, it's these what he called bodyguards, right? The sages are helping to train even the people that they're calling great thieves. So he goes on and says, when a sage is born, great robbers arise. So it is only when you destroy the sages and pardon all the thieves and robbers that the world can become well ordered. That's kind of interesting, right? So it's like totally dismantling this whole framework of thinking about, this right and wrong, the sage and not sage, the robbers, not robbers. He goes on and says, if you create ideals for human kindness and responsible conduct to regulate them. So this would be like the people in control, right? The governors or the priests or the politicians. If you create ideals of human kindness and responsible conduct to regulate them, why, they'll just steal human kindness and responsible conduct and use them to rob you all the more. How do I know this? He who steals a belt buckle is executed, but he who steals a state becomes a feudal lord. Human kindness and responsible conduct are always among the properties found in the homes of the feudal lords. Have they not also stolen human kindness and responsible conduct and all the sagely wisdom? So long as the great robbers continue to go scot-free, as long as these feudal lords continue to be exalted, they will keep stealing human kindness and responsible conduct, together with the weights, measures, scales, balances, tallies, and seals that ensure their advantage. Does that sound at all like stuff we see in modern day society? Where we have people, practicing massive bank fraud. I think back to 2008 with what happened with that whole housing crisis and how this greed just was completely out of control. And not one of the people responsible for that whole process ever saw any kind of punishment for what they did. In fact, they received bailouts for being too big to fail. Matt Taibbi wrote a book on this, and I think the only bank that saw any repercussions for this was a small little family-owned bank, one that was not considered too big to fail, right? So the little person, normal people suffer the consequences of breaking the law. But when you get into these higher positions, it's like they're immune from it. It's like it's encouraged, it's celebrated, it's engaged. And then when they're in those positions, they take over the things that are needed for basically maintaining their position, maintaining their advantage. So when they take over the scales and the balances and the tallies, they're adjusting the laws and the weights and measures in order to be in their favor to continue to maintain their position. Goes on, it's kind of a long chapter, but then he kind of concludes it by saying, everyone in the world knows enough to find out about what they don't know, but none knows enough to find out about what they already know. What do you think that means?
Say that again.
Everyone in the world knows enough to find out about what they don't know, but none knows enough to find out about what they already know. What do you think's happening there?
So processing that.
Yeah.
The second part, there's the first part I get. I mean, it's a very collective thing. Like one person probably wouldn't be able to do that, but if we all put together, if we were to all map out what we do know, we would be able to see the missing puzzle pieces. This is where we don't know. But the other part is much harder for me to grasp. The second part.
Yeah. Well, think about things that we think we know, but in reality, we don't. But we've been convinced that it's true.
Oh, you mean like when people say that I'm an extrovert and I'm super outgoing person and they don't know that I'm an actual introvert?
Well, there could be that, but think about, he's talking about ideas about wisdom here, right? He's talking about kind of thinking about the ways that things are in the world. There's things that we kind of learn either through family or through tradition or through culture that kind of paints the world in a certain way where we have this idea that we know something, we understand something, but that actually then becomes a blind spot because once we think we know something, it's very hard for us to question it. It's very hard for us to reevaluate the things that we think we already know. And with actually good reason, because it's important to be able to build on things that we learn and to continue to grow. But there's also a blind spot that gets created when that happens. And it's not that we have to constantly question everything that we think we know, but we do need to go through processes or periods of reevaluation to kind of look at things and say, does this still actually make sense? Is this still right? He continues and says, everyone knows enough to disapprove of what they consider bad, but none knows enough to disapprove of what they have come to consider good. This is the reason for the great disorder, which violates the brightness of the sun and the moon above and melts away the kernel of vitality within the mountains and rivers below, toppling the ordered succession of the 4 seasons in between. All creatures, down to the smallest wiggling and flittering insects, have thus lost touch with their inborn natures. So here, these things that are being imposed, and he goes through talking about weapons. He goes through talking about this idea of sage wisdom, about the weights and measures, about all the social constructs that he's saying creates this artificial imbalance. He says this has caused everything, right down to the insects, to kind of lose touch with their inborn natures. Again, the Taoist is saying there's a lot that's just kind of baked into who humans are, that if we just let them be themselves, is actually a very positive thing. But when we start tweaking with it, everything gets out of order, gets disordered. If we try to control it, if we try to say, here's the ideal behavior, here's what's good, here's what's bad, now do this kind of a thing. It says that they've lost touch with their inborn natures. This is how profoundly the love of wisdom disrupts the world, abandoning all the many types of generative impulses within them. They instead insist on laborious subservience, letting go of the peaceful blandness of non-doing. They instead delight in ideas and plans full of tis and jabber. It is this tis and jabber that has thrown the world into its present disorder. How's that for a chapter?
That was quite something.
Yeah. So again, we're getting into a lot of questions about more almost kind of like a sociological kind of question about, what is the nature of humans? How do they exist with each other? And what happens when we impose different kinds of structures? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What do you guys think?
I'm hoping that I'm not going to be taking up the space again.
It's okay.
Dwayne, what about you? What do you think? I saw you unmuting earlier.
I don't remember what I was unmuting on. So the question is whether structure is necessary, or
well, do you think it disrupts, like, what would happen if we just kind of let things kind of unfold a bit more naturally versus feeling like we have to control it and structure it?
Well, I'm a fan of permaculture gardening. Do you guys know what that is? Where you just kind of let native things grow next to each other and trust that their innate properties, like of each plant, contributes to the well-being of the other plants around it. So I think there's a naturally ordering structure to a lot of things, that are out there. Whether civilization is our own, like we built it because we needed it, because without fellow human beings, we're kind of, this is why exile was so bad, or things like that, because we depend on each other a lot, even if we feel we're off the grid or antisocial or introverts. There's still, like, I think, a need for other human beings. For the majority, there are people that can get off the grid and they're happy there, but as we see with like urban centers and things, we really do depend on each other. So I think when we get, and that organization is just part of that, structuring that dependency, so the well-being comes out ahead of like the nefarious parts of society. So
Yeah, and I would say the Taoists aren't saying that we don't need other people. There's definitely this idea of sociality that's still a part of what they're talking about. They're just saying it's more the question of how do we do it? Do we come together through a common set of laws and hierarchy in order to have human society, or is human society something that can just evolve naturally? But it's on both sides of the fence. You still have people being together. It's not a question of isolation or individual or hermits versus society. It's how do we structure society, basically.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like the economist point of view, where they would say, well, you need to have rules, you need to have at least some kind of structure, or how do you do trade or things like that, without, you have to say, well, this, when you make an agreement to trade your goats, whatever, for for rugs. I don't know, I'm just thinking off the cuff, but I would think that would need to be in place, is some kind of rule book that says, this, if you make a trade, you need to honor it, especially if you're trading in futures or something like that. So
yeah, well, and I think this would be another good example of what they're getting at in terms of second and third level consequences. So when we get into much larger societies in which we don't actually know each other, that has ongoing consequences about how do we have some kind of guarantees or kind of standards between how we're communicating with people that maybe we don't know personally. So if we go back in time, obviously there was human survival that was happening long before money existed, long before we had something like trade agreements. But that was only possible in much smaller units, where people were much more familiar with each other. And when they would maybe get together, when different tribes would kind of connect with each other, they worked out different ways of doing things. And sometimes they didn't. There was probably, there definitely was battles that have always happened, but obviously not at the same degree that we have now, where you've got the technology and the number of people involved. So it becomes kind of this interesting question where we can say, well, yes, we have to have that, but maybe part of the reason why we say we have to have that is because we're trying to do society in a certain way that then seems like it requires it, but we're not asking the question, is what we're doing with society the right thing? You know what I mean? In terms of like the size or how we're utilizing the technology. And I'm not claiming to have the answers on any of this. I'm just trying to help to present the different perspectives. Yeah, poke the bear.
Yeah, I actually, this is very interesting. I'm looking at it from the perspective of, as you said, Jim, before money, before society, there still was some sort of a society, I guess. And I'm thinking that as all of this evolved, there was probably an element of, power and control, but also I find that I think there was a lot of element of effectiveness and efficiency, and making it easier. The hierarchical structures probably existed informally in the past as well, but with formalizing them, they just made it easier for people to recognize, people to find their place, to find where they can fit and they can be more efficient themselves. And apart from the hunger for power and control, I think there's a good benefit in terms of the separation of duties and understanding of the benefits of collaboration and knowing who can do what and how is that they're the best at doing this while the others are best at doing that. This is how I find our own crews being super efficient when we have the right people as the right project managers and right people as the delivery people, because I, for the love of me, would not be able to manage a project even if I tried. Like there is a I think this hierarchy is just providing a lot of efficiency and better structure for people to find where they need to be. I think that if you look at some natural disasters where people are completely in disarray and cut off from the outside world, they within themselves would still find some leader who would take charge, some leader who would say, you do this, you do that. And I guess the movies artificially show that in the post-apocalyptic scenarios like Walking Dead and such. It's just, I think it's inherent in people that there's some, or they are predisposed to leadership and some who are predisposed to following, and that just the structure just allows this to be more clear. And
yeah, it's interesting when the sociologists weigh in on this. They have some various opinions on it, but there's one book in particular I'm thinking of that I have called Hierarchy in the Forest, that makes a really strong case that when we were in more of our hunter-gatherer stage, that there was a lot of kind of natural, when we think about kind of evolutionary psychology, the kind of traits that humans have that kind of became advantageous for us, that's kind of baked into our DNA, that we had a lot of structures that actually prevented strong men, let's say, from taking over the tribe, that it ended up being far more egalitarian for a long time. In fact, for most of human history. And it wasn't until we moved into more of a settled agrarian kind of a context in which now the social demands changed from what it was previously, needing to maintain strong social bonds for the tribe that's traveling together, to how do we protect this geographical location? How do we protect storehouses of surplus? And then it starts to favor the kinds of behavior that would encourage the strong man, the person who's going to be the, taking control and organizing more of a hierarchical kind of a structure. There's some debates on how that unfolded or if it was consistently that way. There's another book that's kind of interesting called The Dawn of Everything, which wrestles with some of those ideas as well. But interestingly enough, one of the Taoist commentators on this passage, in looking at that series of types of leaders, is looking at it chronologically. That when it's talking about the best leader, is talking about back at, like, let's say that hunter-gatherer kind of phase or that Paleolithic period where they don't appear to be having leaders. And that would be like the ideal. And then as you start to move into more of a settled place and you start to have more of the needs for centralized leadership or more of a strongman kind of position, where you have to protect against enemies and that kind of thing, maybe that's where you start to get than the person that's praised because he helped to rescue us. And maybe that then continues to devolve into harsher and harsher laws of control for conformity. And then that ultimately devolves into a leadership that doesn't actually trust the people, and you've got a very adversarial position. So that's another very interesting way to look at that series of leaders from a historically chronological perspective, as opposed to just the different types of leaders that are on offer right now too. So it's interesting. A lot of fascinating ways that those can be approached. Well, we've got a few minutes left. I've got a meeting coming up right after this, so I want to give us a little bit of a break, but we do have time if there's a couple of questions.
I have actually one more thought about the thieving, which is very bizarre section, I guess, of this lesson. But the more I think about it, in the past, let's say a year, I've been more exposed to the idea of, if you see someone steal a loaf of bread, you did not see them steal a loaf of bread. And the idea of the inequality and the how people got to where they are and how they have to deal with their current circumstances and their environment, and how the principles of ownership and wealth and concentrating of wealth within a single person and not sharing that one wealth is impacting people around us. And made me think about the high prices of groceries and the salaries of the CEOs of the grocery chains and people who are starving on the streets. And when we think about when they need to resort to the what we would call thieving and stealing for themselves, and how is that morally justified, and how do we look at them as the criminals while they're just trying to survive, right? Like there's a lot of, I think, a lot of thinking to be done with our society, and how do we do that, how do we manage that? So yeah, I wanted to share that because another food for thought for literally food for thought for you as well.
Yeah Makes me think of Les Miserables, and kind of that same scenario, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, lots of good questions. And this is again where we think we know something, like, of course, this is the way society should work, or this is the way that the economic system should be. Of course, this particular goals for what we do with our money and our resources is correct, and we don't think to question those. We don't think to look at them because they're settled. They're things that we just think are the way they are. And so it does open up possibilities for kind of reimagining, rethinking. None of this is objective. This is all arbitrary in terms of how it's put together, right? So the only thing that stops us from doing something different is all of us deciding collectively what we want to do. And sometimes, it's very hard for new ideas to emerge, but they certainly can.
My own reaction to that thieving portion in there was, it drew my mind back to some of Jesus' teachings, where he essentially, in order to make a larger point, would seemingly be exalting unethical behavior when that's not really the point. And I wonder if that could be happening here as well, though it sounds like it's from what I heard of your discussion, it sounds like it's going to be taken more literally.
Yeah. I mean, it can go in a lot of different directions, but it definitely brings up questions. When somebody is stealing a loaf of bread because they're going to die otherwise, how do we view that versus, some bank CEO that's making decisions that causes, thousands, if not, hundreds of thousands of people to lose their homes, and they make off with a bunch of money, and that's considered okay, or considered good business, or they don't get persecuted. Is that, how do we justify those two different things? And that's the distinction they're making between, a great robber, large, the big guy versus somebody, like he said, who steals a belt buckle. You know, they get executed, but somebody can steal the whole country and they're praised. You know, it's very interesting circumstances that we find ourselves in. Well, great discussion, I think. Hope that gives you some good stuff to think about. And if you're interested in joining our discussion, if you're watching the video, you can go to www.kinship.cafe and register your email, and you'll get notifications about our live Zoom presentation, as well as links to the latest videos. So with that, I'll catch you guys later, and thanks so much for joining.